AMD launched its Ryzen 5000 series processors back in late 2020, and coupled with the venerable AM4 platform, this has proven to be a very strong success over the past couple of years. But that AM4 platform, it's been around for 6 years now. It's time for an update, and this is where AM5 comes in. So with the brand new AM5 platform, what are we going to be powering that with? Brand new Ryzen 7000 series Zen 4 processors. Today, we're examining the 16-core Ryzen 9 7950X flagship and the 8-core Ryzen 7 7700X. The 12 and 6-core reviews will follow in the near future. So with the new underlying Zen 4 architecture, DDR5 and PCIe Gen 5 support on the AM5 platform, and manufacturing using TSMC's 5nm process node, let's take a closer look at the £739.99 Ryzen 9 7950X and the £419.99 Ryzen 7 7700X. We have an absolute ton of information and performance data and analysis to get through in this video review, so we're going to have to keep our in-depth look at the Zen 4 architecture and AM5 platform to a relatively brief overview. If you want the more in-depth technical details, then they're over on the written page on the KitGuru website, so please do check that out. I do encourage you. Some of the key points that we'll reference here are relating to the core. Versus Zen 3, Zen 4 doubles the L2 cache capacity to 1 MB per core. We get AVX 512 support via a double pumping of the 256-bit wide data path. The core chiplet, made up of an 8-core CCX, is manufactured using the TSMC 5nm process node and features 6.5 billion transistors in a 70mm squared area. We still get 32 megs of L3 cache on the CCX, but there's no 3D cache on the processor. That's for future 3D releases. The I/O die is manufactured using a 6nm process node and features 3.4 billion transistors in a 122mm squared area. We get 28 lanes of PCIe Gen 5 connectivity, with 4 reserved for chipset connectivity in Gen 4 mode. There's DDR5 support up to 5200 MHz native, albeit potentially as low as 3600 MHz for 2 DIMMs per channel. And 2x16GB DDR5 6000 MHz is the new sweet spot, as this works ideally with the 3000 MHz memory controller. Above 6000 MHz DDR5 and the memory controller will downclock using a 2-to-1 divider, but the Infinity Fabric maintains at 2000 MHz with that overclocked RAM, and thankfully it's not linked to the memory controller anymore. So if you push the DDR5 speeds higher and force a 2-to-1 downclock on the memory controller, you'll still get your 2000 MHz Infinity Fabric. And there's also a built-in RDNA 2 GPU on the processors, and more on that later in the review. The new AM5 platform features a 1718-pin LGA socket, so the pins are now on the motherboard. We also see new TDPs as high as 170 watts for 230 watts of package power delivery. AM4 CPU cooler compatibility is maintained, provided the standard AMD backplate is used. And currently, we have X670 and X670E motherboards, but B650 and B650E will be more affordable, and they will be coming soon. Ryzen 9 7950X has 16 cores and 32 threads with 64 MB of level 3 cache and 16 megs of L2 cache. This 5nm dual CCD chip features a rated base clock of 4.5 GHz and a maximum boost clock of up to a lofty 5.7 GHz. A 170 watt rated TDP means up to 230 watts of stock clocked package power is allowed, and as such, just like all the other Ryzen 7000 processors, there's no included box cooler, which I'm absolutely fine with, to be honest. The $699 Ryzen 9 7950X will sell for just under £740, including VAT in the UK. That's actually similar to the launch price of Ryzen 9 5950X back in the day, despite the turbulence currently we're seeing with the GBP. Competition comes in the form of the incumbent Ryzen 9 5950X that we're seeing currently for around about £520 on the market. And then on the Intel side of things, you've got the roughly £620 to £700 Core i9 12900K or KS, plus the DDR5 equipped Z690 platform. Of course, until 13th gen Intel launches shortly, that is. Ryzen 7 7700X has 8 cores, 16 threads, 32 megs of level 3 cache, and 8 megs of level 2. This is a single CCD chip, so it's just the 5nm fabbed core chiplet alongside the 6nm built I/O die. The base clock is rated at 4.5 GHz with maximum boost listed at 5.4 GHz thanks to its 105 watt TDP. And this $399 chip will sell for just under £420 in the UK. Competition for the new 8-core Zen chip comes from multiple vectors actually. You've got the £380 Ryzen 9 5900X and the roughly £440 Ryzen 7 5800X 3D on the relatively budget at this point M4 platform. And there's also the roughly £430 or so Core i7 12700K on the advanced Z690 platform, once again until it's replaced by 13th gen. We will be pitting the new Ryzen 7000 series chips against their logical Ryzen 5000 and Intel 12th gen competitors. The AM4 based Ryzen 5000 processors will be coupled with an X570 motherboard and 32 gigs of dual rank DDR4 memory in 3600 MHz C16 form. Both DDR5 platforms use 32GB 6000 MHz sets from G-Skill's Trident Z5 range, though the timings differ slightly, with the AMD Expo kit running at 30, 38, 38, 96 versus the Intel XMP set at 36, 36, 36, 96. But this is pretty close between the two sets. The new AMD processors are tested on Gigabyte's X670E Aorus master motherboard, featuring the BIOS revision and a GSA profile as supplied and validated by AMD. And looking at the VRM solution, including the cooling on this motherboard, yeah, we're not going to have to worry about downclocking on the motherboard side of things, that's for sure. A new test platform means new partnering hardware. It's time to retire our old trusty RTX 3080 that served us for quite a while. We've enhanced our CPU testing setup to include an AMD Radeon RX 6950 XT graphics card for pixel pushing power. We specifically chose the 6950 XT thanks to its superb performance at 1080p and 1440p resolutions, the former of which is critical for assessing CPU gaming capabilities. And our specific board of choice is the monstrously large and tremendously well-cooled Sapphire Nitro Plus Pure model. We've also enhanced the power supply setup with Seasonic's new 1600 watt Prime models delivering clean and consistent juice. 1600 watts may seem like overkill, so keep watching if you think that is indeed the case. And then rounding it out, all platforms get a 360mm all-in-one liquid cooler for cooling on their open air test bench. With regards to test procedures, we're applying our usual process, so do make sure you check out the KitGuru main written webpage if you want more details on that. Let's jump into the testing. Looking at a comparison of power draw, we can see just how thirsty the new Ryzen 9 7950X flagship is set to be. Running at just over 5 GHz all-core, 215 watts of package power, because the 360mm all-in-one in a 25 degrees Celsius ambient could not maintain 230 watts, is a very lofty power draw. This was almost 350 watts from the wall, and that's before the GPU load is added into the equation. That 1.6 kilowatt PSU I mentioned earlier, it doesn't look like such an overkill investment now, does it? In fact, only the Core i9 12900K running under the motherboard vendor's ludicrous power settings demanded more energy. The 7950X's power consumption increase versus the Ryzen 9 5950X predecessor is roughly 50%. With a 105 watt TDP limiting package power delivery to 142 watts maximum, the Ryzen 7 7700X is clearly less juicy than its bigger brother, and it runs at 5.18 GHz all-core. Because of that 142 watt allowance, its power consumption falls very much in line with the Ryzen 5000 series predecessors. It's also far more power friendly than the Unleashed mode Core i7 12700K to the tune of more than 20 watts. Uber high power consumption for the Ryzen 9 7950X unsurprisingly translates into extremely high temperature levels. And just as we saw with Ryzen 5000, the dense, concentrated heat load applied to the 8-core processor also translates into high temperature levels for Ryzen 7 7700X. There's nothing inherently wrong with these chips running at 95 degrees Celsius, because that's the way that AMD tunes the Precision Boost 2 algorithm. Push the temperature, push the power, gun for frequency. And that's just the same, like there's nothing wrong with running the Core i9 12900K close towards its 99 degrees Celsius limit. The key challenge though, that comes from a cooling perspective. Not only will you need a beefy CPU cooler to keep the numbers in check, but that's more of a power equation than a temperature equation purely. The problem is that as soon as your motherboard or your CPU cooler sees numbers like 95 degrees Celsius, it is going to ramp that fan up to the maximum. So trying to get a well-tuned system from a noise perspective, that's going to be a far more nuanced and difficult task with numbers in the plus 90 degrees Celsius range. That's something to bear in mind. And it's one of the key caveats and differences between Ryzen 7000 as we're seeing now versus Ryzen 5000 where sub 70 was very common, and even the Core i7-12700K, which is a tolerable temperature. At least we don't see any signs of concern for heat extraction from the soldered heat spreader on Ryzen 7000 though. Looking at Blender classroom rendering performance, the new Ryzen 9 7950X takes a commanding lead at the top of our chart. The next best processors, AMD's 16-core 5950X and Intel's 12900K, are way behind in this multi-threaded rendering test. The Ryzen 7 7700X is far less impressive though, with the performance showing that it is reasonable but is slower than its Core i7-12700K and Ryzen 9 5900X competitors. Yes, both of those chips have higher thread counts than AMD's new 8-core, but they're positioned at similar price points too. So AMD doesn't fare too well in this market segment for the new Ryzen 7 7700X. Cinebench R23 NT shows much of the same trend as Blender. The new Ryzen 9 7950X is an absolute performance monster thanks to its 32 threads pumping away at lofty clock speeds. But those same Zen 4 clock speed benefits cannot help the Ryzen 7 7700X overcome its thread count deficit versus its realistic price competitors, the 12700K and the 5900X. Single thread performance is superb on the new Ryzen 7000 series chips. The flagship 7950X boosts as high as 5.7 GHz and therefore delivers chart-topping performance that is above the speedy Core i9-12900K. And the 5.55 GHz peak of AMD's Ryzen 7 7700X in our testing positions it at third place on our chart, beating the 12700K competitor and smashing the 5900X. The performance uplifts for Zen 4 versus Zen 3 in a single-threaded domain are outstanding. The Ryzen 9 7950X is once again top dog in our Handbrake H264 test. We see a 26% performance lead versus the Core i9-12900K, and compared to its 5950X predecessor, the 7950X is 35% quicker. They are outstanding results. The Ryzen 7 7700X is far more competitive versus its price contenders in this test. Now, its performance is within touching distance of the Core i7-12700K and Ryzen 9 5900X, though it is worth confirming that both of the 7700X's competitors are technically faster by a small margin. H265 video conversion sees the 7950X present another huge win, with a 19% uplift versus the 12900K, and now we see the architectural improvements of Zen 4 present the Ryzen 7 7700X with a healthy lead versus the 12700K and 5900X. As is the trend at this point, the Ryzen 9 7950X tops our chart by a mile in 7-zips workloads. Compression performance for the Zen 4 16-core is 38% higher than the 12900K and 29% better than the 5950X. The Ryzen 7 7700X also does well in the compression test when bolstered by the high bandwidth of DDR5 memory. AMD's new Zen 4 8-core provides a performance result that matches the 12-core Ryzen 9 5900X, whilst also outperforming the Core i7-12700K. As always, AMD's Zen architecture is very strong with decompression performance in 7-zip. The 7950X is a ludicrous 84% higher performance than the Core i9-12900K, and it outperforms the Zen 3 5950X by a solid 24% too. This same architectural proficiency for 7-zip's decompression workload boosts the Ryzen 7 7700X to a score that almost matches the Core i9-12900K. This makes it significantly faster than the Core i7-12700K competitor, though it is well behind the performance level of its 12-core Zen 3 contender. Support for dual-channel DDR5 memory on the new Ryzen 7000 chips provides a significant boost to memory bandwidth scores versus Zen 3 with DDR4. With that said, Intel's DDR5-equipped 12th gen platform offers consistently higher memory bandwidth in our testing, and the margins in favour of Intel's setup are actually very wide, despite running at the same DDR5 6000 MHz configuration. As a side note, it is good to see the half-speed write penalty for the single CCD Zen 3 chips not present on the single CCD Zen 4 Ryzen 7 7700X. And despite jumping up to higher speed, higher latency DDR5 memory, AMD does a good job to keep actual latency numbers in check. Here we see values that roughly match Intel's 12th gen platform in its DDR5 configuration. If you're interested in 3D Mark numbers, the 7950X does very well in the CPU profile benchmark, but the 7700X isn't appealing versus its competition. The more gaming-focused Time Spy test, however, still favours Intel's 12th gen by a notable margin. Let's move on to gaming performance and look first at 1080p results. Assassin's Creed Valhalla shows very little difference between all of these test chips when paired with a Radeon RX 6950 XT graphics card. Ryzen 7000 does well with 1% low frame rates, but there's very little in it, other than the Ryzen 7 5800X 3D opening up a slight lead versus everything else. Borderlands 3 has the 7950X roughly tying with the 12900K, neither of which can compete with AMD's 3D V-Cache equipped 5800X 3D. The 7700X is a few frames behind the 12700K for average and 1% lows, but it does outperform the 5900X by a similarly tight margin. There isn't too much to say with F1 2021. These numbers are all so high that there's little value in comparing 5 to 7 average FPS differences between the new Zen 4 chips and the 12900K or 5800X 3D. Far Cry 6 continues its historical favouring of the Intel architecture, though AMD's new Zen 4 processors go some considerable way in closing the gap. The 12900K is out in front by a notable margin, but the difference between Ryzen 7000 and the Core i7 12700K are less pronounced. Interesting in this one is that Far Cry 6 clearly prefers AMD's new Zen 4 architecture as opposed to a sizable slab of L3 cache as on the Ryzen 7 5800X 3D. This is the first game thus far where we have seen the new 7950X and 7700X comfortably outperform AMD's best Ryzen 5000 gaming chip. Despite not working properly on our AM4 test system, we still include some data for Hitman 3. Both Intel 12th gen chips are strong here, particularly the 12900K with a 1% low FPS number in triple digit territory. The Ryzen 7 7700X delivers strong performance in isolation. Everybody will be happy with a 184 FPS average, but its 1% low values are notably behind the 12700K competitor. Shadow of the Tomb Raider plays very well on Zen 4, with only AMD's Ryzen 7 5800X 3D outgunning the new 7950X via a healthy 1% low improvement. The 7700X drops back in 1% low FPS numbers compared to its 16-core sibling, but the average frame rate is still very healthy and positions it well ahead of the 5900X and 12700K contenders. Watch Dogs Legion is very tight at the top, but Intel's 12th gen chips do come out best in our chart. The two Ryzen 7000 processors roughly match the 5800X 3D in this game though, so that's a positive result for the newcomers. When looking at a summary of 1080p gaming performance with Hitman 3 excluded, the new Ryzen 7000 series processors show a healthy improvement versus Ryzen 5000 in general. Of course, that's excluding the special case of the 3D V-Cache equipped Ryzen 7 5800X 3D. Intel's 12th gen core competitors are still tough for Ryzen 7000 to deal with, and they will often trade places in our charts. It's important to examine which games you're most interested in and how they perform on each CPU. That's because the Ryzen 7 5800X 3D still tends to be the best gaming chip on a game-by-game basis, even if the data created in our relative performance chart doesn't necessarily highlight that trend particularly clearly, which is mainly due to Far Cry 6 being such a performance hit for Zen 3 processors. Now, let's focus on 1440p gaming results with a handful of the most important chips. Here we expect to see the performance margin squeezed as the effect of GPU performance saturation holds a greater influence. To summarise our 1440p gaming results, you really are not going to notice significant worthwhile differences between Ryzen 7000, Ryzen 7 5800X 3D and Core i9 12900K unless you have copious amounts of GPU horsepower that can push to ludicrously high frame rates. Any of these solutions will be fine for 1440p gamers with a high-end, current-day graphics card. With both Ryzen 7000 processors running at close to 95 degrees Celsius under stock conditions, we couldn't really overclock by the normal domain because we just ran out of thermal headroom even with a 360mm all-in-one. As such, our tuning focused on two specific factors: reduced TDP modes to see how each chip operated under more tolerable power conditions, and undervolting to the tune of minus 100 millivolts to see if this could force a higher frequency via lower power consumption and therefore lower temperatures in the Precision Boost 2 algorithm. Package power dropped by around 10 watts for both Ryzen 7000 chips when undervolted by 100 millivolts, despite clocks jumping by 100 to 150 megahertz on the processors. And alongside the frequency bumps, both chips also managed to stay away from their 95 degrees Celsius limits. Reduced TDP modes are clearly where the Ryzen 9 shines. At 105 watt TDP in Cinebench, the same as the Ryzen 9 5950X it replaces, AMD's new flagship is 28% quicker than the 12900K and 36% faster than the Zen 3 16-core. Even when severely limited to 65-watt TDP, the 7950X still maintains a healthy lead over the Core i9 and the Ryzen 9 5950X. That's remarkable. Clearly AMD wasn't messing around when they said that Zen 4 shines at 65 watts. The Ryzen 7 7700X also fares well at reduced power levels by maintaining a high percentage of its stock performance. For Ryzen 7000, the I/O die features an integrated GPU that uses two RDNA 2 compute units. AMD said that this was realistically included to allow for fundamentally businesses to run the system without a dedicated GPU where it just wasn't needed, so maybe for CAD/CAM purposes or just office productivity tasks. As we've seen on the Intel side of things though, having an integrated GPU does have its benefits from not only redundancy and resiliency perspective if your DGPU breaks, but also from media encode and decode capabilities. Plus, as we confirmed in our own testing, there's nothing actually stopping you firing up a game. We run GTA 5 at 1080p low settings, and it was honestly surprisingly playable. No, you're not going to be pushing above 60 FPS all the time, but you're well above 30 FPS in general, and actually had some fun playing this game on an integrated GPU. That's pretty remarkable in my opinion. On the media consumption front, AV1 decode is supported as we tested successfully with 4K 60 YouTube through Edge. 8K 30 AV1 actually worked too, but this was running through the GPU rendering hardware rather than the efficient media decoder. H264 and H265 4K 60 content is handled without hassle through VLC Media Player, plus encode capability is supported too. And if you're most interested in YouTube playback, we can watch 4K 30 and 4K 60 VP9 content without stress. Focusing on the main point of this iGPU though, that's display connectivity, AMD highlights support for up to 4 independent displays. These can be connected via HDMI 2.1, DisplayPort 2.0, UHBR10, and USB-C with DisplayPort Alt mode. Of course, those connections will depend upon your motherboard or system vendor. And AMD highlights 4K 60 display support. We couldn't actually test if there was 8K capability because we haven't got an 8K monitor. Personally, I'd call the RDNA 2 iGPU inclusion a nice deal sweetener. Many people won't use it, but many people will use it and they'll find it valuable at some point for some reason. And that's a good inclusion in my opinion. If we look at a clock for clock comparison to examine Zen 3 versus Zen 4, we see the 7950X and its new architecture sometimes delivering double-digit performance gains over the 5950X. Of course, high bandwidth DDR5 helps here too, but the performance uplift for Zen 4 looks strong on a specifically clock for clock comparison. When it comes to Cinebench performance per pound money spent, the Ryzen 9 7950X does very well, particularly when factoring in the price premium of a high-end flagship product. But the Ryzen 7 7700X struggles versus its 12700K and 5900X competitors that are similarly priced but faster. Looking at the Cinebench performance per watt numbers as a guide for the productivity, performance, efficiency of each processor, top of the chart is AMD's venerable 5950X, but the new 7950X is not far behind. This is an interesting point as the new 16-core flagship certainly isn't friendly when it comes to power draw numbers, but it does deliver outstanding multi-threaded performance, so I guess that's absolutely fine. The Ryzen 7 7700X also does reasonably well in terms of power efficiency, sitting between its two primary competitors. I'll start this conclusion by saying that I think there's a very reasonable argument to be had that both of these processors should have been offered at a TDP step lower than they actually are. Personally, I appreciate AMD's decisions to give us pedal-to-the-metal processors that use plenty of power in order to squeeze out every last drop of performance. Fundamentally, this is what Intel has been doing for many generations, particularly so with the more recent revisions of its core lineup. But there are clear caveats to this approach when it comes to power consumption and cooling numbers. In gaming, fine, go all out with the numbers, give us all the performance we can handle. But in day-to-day usage, personally, I'd probably tune the TDP down by 1 rank on both of these chips and enjoy the lower noise output and lower thermal output from my system, which in the UK, where nobody has air conditioning, that's quite important. So yeah, that might sound like some negative feedback on the power and thermal performance of these chips, and to be perfectly honest, it probably is. But it's also incredibly positive feedback for the sheer performance scalability that AMD's Zen architecture continues to offer. You can shed about a third of the power draw off the flagship 16-core chip and see Cinebench performance decrease by less than 10%. That's highly impressive. Focusing on the Ryzen 7 7700X, I have to be honest and say that I'm less impressed with this chip than its 16-core flagship sibling. Firstly, AMD's new Zen 4 8-core is a huge improvement versus the Zen 3 8-core chips it replaced in terms of productivity performance. But versus the realistic competition, the 12700K and 5900X, the 7700X certainly struggles to shine, as it is often just behind matching the competitors rather than beating them. Power efficiency is another area where the 7700X doesn't really shine versus the 5900X or 12700K. That is, unless you switch to the 65W TDP Eco mode on AMD's new 8-core, but you could also run Eco mode on the Ryzen 9 5900X, so that's a bit of a moot point. For gaming performance, this is good on the Ryzen 7 Zen 4 part, and it's much better than the 5900X. But that Core i7 12700K is a tough competitor in terms of raw FPS numbers, and at this roughly £420 or so price point, it is incredibly difficult to overlook the gaming king, which still looks to be the gaming king, the Ryzen 7 5800X 3D. So that is a tough competitor, again, for the 7700X. So yeah, the Ryzen 7 7700X is a good addition to AMD's product catalogue, but let's be realistic, it's going to have its work cut out trying to shine versus the 5900X on the previous, cheaper AM4 platform, the 12700K on the advanced Z690 platform, or even the Ryzen 7 5800X 3D, which is a gaming stormer. Yeah, tough battles ahead for this one, I think. Moving on to the Ryzen 9 7950X, in general, I'd say that this is an absolutely fantastic processor. Users buying a 16-core flagship are probably users who have genuine productivity workloads that they need to run to make money or to make business sense. So performance on tap is important, and that's what the 7950X gives you. You get impressive single-threaded performance coupled with outstanding multi-threaded performance across the board. The high number of well-designed Zen 4 cores run at incredibly lofty frequencies to deliver remarkable performance gains in rendering applications or video conversion or file manipulation tasks. And if you want to do gaming on the system during your working downtime, then yeah, the 7950X is about as good as there is on the market. The clear downsides of this one are the chip's high power consumption and thermal numbers, but to be perfectly honest, I'd say the performance probably somewhat warrants those lofty figures. So I'll give AMD a pass on that one, particularly because you have so much scalability to tune down the TDP and enjoy some more appropriate numbers. Of course, we can't summarize Ryzen 7000 without also putting a bit of focus on the brand new AM5 platform. Put simply, AM5 looks to be superb and will definitely take the fight to Intel's LGA 1700 alternative. AMD now offers users DDR5 memory compatibility, plenty of PCIe Gen 5 connectivity, and the most modern interfaces such as 20 gigabits per second USB. AM5 motherboards look to be very healthy indeed, but we'll get more in depth on those in the individual reviews. Plus, we're still waiting on the B650 chipset, as those motherboards could swing the value pendulum in favour of AMD. And I'm going to emphasise it again, the inclusion of that integrated GPU on the Ryzen 7000 processors, that's a nice tick on the checkbox for the AM5 platform. So I've been Luke Hill for KitGuru. Thank you for watching our video review of the brand new Ryzen 9 7950X and Ryzen 7 7700X processors. Zen 4, AM5, they're here to stay. Let us know what you think in the comment section down below. Which one of these particularly interests you? Do you want the big dog? Are you happy with the Ryzen 7 8-core? Let us know. So if you like this video, give us a like and subscribe, do all that YouTube stuff, support the channel, really helps us out. Please do check out the main written page on the KitGuru website, that also supports us massively. And if you want to follow us more, then check out our pages on different social media channels, Discord, all that stuff. Buy a cool t-shirt on our merch store, support us on Patreon, and check back for the next video. See you soon.